In this video lecture, I want to pick up the story of the Macedonian dynasty and take a look today at the life and career of Alexander the Great, son of Philip II. And we will pick up our story in the year 336 after the assassination of Philip, and we'll see that Alexander will quickly liquidate any potential rival for the throne, and he will win recognition as king by the Macedonian nobility. Alexander is 20 years old at this time. He is a seasoned battlefield veteran, and he is well liked and respected by the Macedonian hierarchy. So in several lightning-fast campaigns, he will subdue Macedonia's traditional enemies to the west and north, who thought this would be a good opportunity to try their luck at achieving some territorial gains at the expense of Macedonia. And then Alexander will compel the southern Greeks, who had rebelled against the League of Corinth that Philip had created. Some of these Greek poleis will revolt, and Alexander will swiftly deal with them. And he'll actually use the city of Thebes as an example. He'll utterly destroy that city in 335 as punishment for its rebellion from the Corinthian League. So with Greece pacified, Alexander in 334 BC is ready to lead a Macedonian and Greek army into Anatolia to fulfill his father's plan to avenge the Persian attacks on Greece in the 490s and 480s. So Alexander was likely also motivated by what he believed was an opportunity to create a heroic image of himself as a warrior as glorious as the incomparable Achilles of Homer's Iliad. Alexander always kept a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, and his behavior on the battlefield would represent the ultimate expression of the Homeric vision of the conquering warrior hero. So that was likely a motivation too. Now, the timing favored Alexander, the timing for an invasion. The Persian Empire was in disarray. The long-reigning king Artaxerxes was poisoned, and his youngest son took the throne as Artaxerxes IV. But this new king ruled for less than 2 years, and we're told by the sources that he was murdered in 336, the same year that Philip was assassinated. Then a Persian noble named Artashata took the throne under the name Darius III. And this new king was part of the broader Achaemenid family, but he was not a close relative of Artaxerxes IV. And although this new king, Darius, had a reputation for bravery and connections at the palace court, many Persian nobles doubted his legitimacy. And of course, he faced the same problems that were always faced by new Persian kings. Shortly after he took the throne, revolts erupted in Babylon and likely in Egypt. So Darius needed time to solidify his hold on power, but of course time was something he didn't have. He was about to face an invasion led by Alexander of Macedon. Now, when we look at Alexander's campaigns, and we will look at them in some detail because he is considered by many historians to be the greatest military commander in history, we'll see that Alexander obviously inherited quite a few advantages thanks to his father Philip's efforts to construct the Macedonian war machine. Alexander will use the tactics that his father created. You may remember the hammer and anvil approach to achieving victory, in which the phalanx pins the opponent, and then the companion cavalry finds a gap in the enemy line that can be exploited with a charge that will totally dislocate the enemy position. Such was the case, you may remember, at Chaeronea, when the Macedonians defeated an alliance of Thebans and Athenians. And such will be the case in the major battles that Alexander will fight against the Persians. Now, I've created a type of memory or mnemonic device to get you guys to remember the sequence of battles that occurs. And if you can remember the slogan, "Get Inside the Gap, Hero," each one of those letters stands for a battle in the sequence in which it is fought. The G stands for the Granicus River, at the first battle that Alexander will fight against the Persians. And the I stands for the Battle of Issus, which is the next battle. The T stands for the Siege of Tyre, along the coast of what is now Lebanon. The G for the Battle of Gaugamela, fought in what is now northern Iraq. And finally the H, which will cover the Battle of the Hydaspes River near what is now the India-Pakistan border. So, Get Inside the Gap, Hero takes us through Alexander's major victories. Now, in 334 BC, Alexander crosses the Hellespont from Europe to Asia, and he is quickly going to be confronted by the Persian army. But the Persian leaders and the troops were inexperienced, in contrast to the Macedonians, who had been fighting constantly under Philip for nearly 20 years. Now, the Persians did hire Greek mercenaries, and one of these mercenary commanders, Memnon of Rhodes, he advised the Persian satraps to burn all the crops in the region and avoid battle. And then, of course, Alexander would run out of food and would have to likely withdraw. But the satraps, they wanted to save their estates and the crops. They pressed for battle. And this first battle of the overall campaign is fought at the Granicus River in western Anatolia, Asia Minor. And the river was a good place for a defense, but the Persian commanders showed their inexperience by deploying very oddly. The Persian cavalry lined the riverbank while the infantry drew up on a ridge behind the cavalry. And that's kind of the opposite of how it's supposed to work, because in these positions, the infantry and the cavalry couldn't support each other. So at the Granicus River, Alexander will use the hammer and anvil tactics that he learned from his father. First, the Macedonians are going to hit the Persian left flank, and some Persians are going to cross into the river to counter this, and that will create that opening, that gap that Alexander sought. The Macedonian phalanx, the anvil, crossed the river to pin the enemy in place, and then Alexander's cavalry, the hammer, charged in. Now, the Persians no doubt fought bravely, but when the cavalry was nearly surrounded, it fled, and that left the Greek mercenaries on their own. And Alexander's troops basically surrounded and killed all of the Greek mercenaries who had been fighting for the Persians. So fast forward a little bit, in early summer 333, Alexander's army came down off the Anatolian plateau, and moving swiftly, the Macedonians are able to force their way through what were called the Cilician Gates. It was a narrow choke point that the Persians had not adequately defended. Otherwise, they could have blocked Alexander's army from proceeding any further. The Macedonians then marched east from Tarsus to Issus, and Darius advanced through the Amanus Mountains north of Issus, and he used a little-known pass that Alexander hadn't guarded, and actually Darius comes onto the plain of Issus behind Alexander's army. And Alexander knows that he can no longer proceed anywhere forwards, so he's got to turn back and face Darius and eliminate this threat in his rear. So Darius' plan was to smash the Macedonian left, and when the Persian right-wing cavalry charged, it almost shattered the Macedonian flank, and Alexander had to quickly pull troops from his right wing to help his left. In the center, Darius' Greek mercenaries had found gaps in the Macedonian phalanx, as that phalanx tried to climb the steep banks of the Panoris River. Then, on the right flank, Alexander led a charge that routed the Persian left wing and brought Alexander within sight of Darius himself. And some Greek sources claim that Darius at that point fled in panic with what was left of his left wing. But others say he fought bravely and retreated only after his honor guard had been killed. Now, the victory at Issus opened up the eastern Mediterranean coast to Alexander, who headed south for Egypt. Alexander used this march as an opportunity to neutralize the Persian navy by capturing all the main seaports of Phoenicia. Now, many of these port cities surrendered without a fight, although Tyre, a heavily fortified city on the coast of what is now Lebanon, refused to surrender to him. And so Alexander has to employ the siege engines and catapults and other siege technology that had been developed by his father to ultimately breach its walls. And after a lengthy siege of over 6 months, Tyre capitulated. And then Alexander next took over Egypt, and on the coast to the west of the Nile River, Alexander founded a new city in 331 named Alexandria, after himself, of course, and this is the first of many cities he would later go on to establish as far east as Afghanistan. And during his time in Egypt, Alexander also paid a visit to the oracle of the god Zeus Ammon, whom the Greeks regarded as identical to Zeus, at the oasis of Siwa, far out in the western Egyptian desert, and you can see it there on the map. And Alexander told no one the details of his consultation of the oracle, but the news got out that he had been informed that he was the son of Zeus. And you better believe he joyfully accepted this designation as being a true story. So now we have, entering into Alexander's psyche, not only the kind of warrior hero ethos represented by the Homeric hero Achilles, but now he begins to sincerely believe that he is the son of Zeus, and therefore he himself is a god. So in early 331, the Macedonians will set out from Egypt to confront Darius, who had had plenty of time to build himself a new army. And the Macedonians will arrive in Upper Mesopotamia in early fall of 331, somewhere in mid-September, where they found Darius and his new army had taken up a position near the village of Gaugamela, east of the Tigris River. And Darius even had time to level an already relatively flat area. There was a wide plain there, and Darius had some of his military engineers level it even further because he wants to make the best use of his scythe chariots and elephants, as well as cavalry. And the idea is the elephants and chariots will break up the Macedonian phalanx, and then the cavalry will outflank and crush Alexander. So that's the plan anyway, heading into this. And so on October the 1st, 331, the two sides confront each other. And it became clear to Alexander right away that the Persians outnumbered his army. But Alexander formed his units very cleverly. He deployed them very cleverly into something of a box or a square so that they couldn't be outflanked even if the Persians were to spill around either his left or his right flank. So the Macedonians advanced diagonally against the left flank of the Persian line, gradually moving away from the leveled area that the Persians had cleared. And of course, this degraded the effectiveness of Darius's chariots. And ultimately, Alexander's cavalry will find a gap in the Persian line. And once again, Alexander is going to charge at the head of the companion cavalry straight for Darius's war chariot. And again, just as at Issus, the great king Darius is going to flee the battlefield, and shortly after, the Persian effort will collapse entirely. And almost immediately, Alexander is going to proclaim himself king of Asia in place of the now vanquished Persian king. And As he had done earlier in Egypt, Alexander left the local administrative system of the Persian Empire in place. He even retained some Persian governors to act on his behalf. And many scholars have speculated, based on some of the sources, that Alexander's long-term aim seems to have been to forge an administrative corps composed of Macedonians, Greeks, and Persians, working together to rule the territory he conquered with his army. Now, as for Darius, in his final days, he may have considered surrendering to Alexander, but some of his fellow Persians arrested him and put him in what were believed to have been golden chains, and they kept moving east toward Bactria as we move towards Central Asia in the Afghanistan area. And when they learned that Alexander and a Macedonian detachment were actually in hot pursuit, these Persian nobles who had kidnapped Darius, they stab him and they leave him to die by the roadside. From the heartland of Persia, Alexander, in 329, he marches northeast into the trackless steppes of Bactria, again, modern Afghanistan, and he finds it a tough slog. He is unable to completely subdue the highly mobile tribesmen who lived in the area and who were very reluctant to bow down before this new conqueror. And they conducted a type of guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics. And ultimately, Alexander, increasingly exhausted by the time and effort needed to subdue these people, settles for an alliance that he sealed by marrying a Bactrian princess, Roxanne, in 327. And it's around this same period, though, that Alexander will cold-bloodedly suppress a real, maybe an imagined, maybe resistance that he felt was growing amongst his own Macedonian officer corps. And he used accusations of treachery and disloyalty as a justification for the execution of several high-ranking members of his general staff. Now, these supposed plots and Alexander's cold-blooded suppression of them are a type of foreshadow of things to come, because we have to remember the Macedonian army has been on the march for a long, long time, and many of the men are wondering, when are we just going to have enough and just settle in for a nice governing of this empire we have created. But Alexander, his appetite for conquest seems to be insatiable. And what is also disturbing to his close comrades, his Macedonian comrades, is that Alexander has taken a liking to some Eastern customs, including the Persian custom, what was called proskinesis. This idea that anybody who approaches the king must prostrate themselves absolutely. And the Macedonians were not used to this type of behavior. They were basically, the king was first among equals, but there was always a mutual respect that had been established and was expected in relations between the Macedonian king and his nobles, his officers. So there is a lot to be troubled by as these guys are watching Alexander seem to be changing. Now, from Bactria, Alexander makes things worse because he decides to continue to head east to India. And again, this indicates an insatiable desire to go ever further beyond what he believed anybody had done before. And in India, there will be, again, that one major battle against an Indian prince named Porus at the Hydaspes River in 326. So with the Hydaspes, we've completed our sequence of Get Inside the Gap hero. Now, the Macedonians are going to be victorious, but after months of marching through monsoon rains, Alexander's soldiers mutiny on the banks of another river, the Hyphasis, in western India. And Alexander is forced to agree to lead them home. These men want to go home. And it is said that Alexander was so angry at this that he sulked in his tent, and it reminded some of Achilles. You may remember from the Iliad where Achilles refuses to fight and he sulks in his tent. And he's hoping perhaps to shame his soldiers into continuing the march eastward, but the soldiers have had it. So after this mutiny, they do return home, but Alexander is going to take the long and scenic route, and that's going to cause some problems because he'll lead his army down the course of the Indus River, and along the way, he took out his frustration at being stopped on his eastward march by his army's mutiny. He would slaughter every settlement, village, and city that he came to. And he, during the course of these operations, would risk his life more flamboyantly than ever before. And there was even one point where they had been besieging an Indian town, and he is the first man over the wall, but nobody is there to support him, and he's alone facing a numerous enemy, and he's almost killed. He is actually severely wounded. So there's this recklessness that Alexander had always displayed, but it seems to be heightened the more that he feels frustrated. And then when the army does reach the mouth of the Indus River along the Indian Ocean, Alexander turns a portion of his army west through the Gedrosian Desert. And another portion is going to take an easier route, and a third group is going to sail westward along the coast to explore possible sites for new settlements and harbors. And, of course, Alexander himself is going to lead the contingent that goes through the desert, the harshest route home. And it's along this route that many of his soldiers are going to die on the march. I mean, this is a place where the temperatures have been recorded as high as 127 degrees in the shade. So it is a nightmare for Alexander's army. But he doesn't seem to be done, because even when they arrive back at one of the old Persian capital cities of Susa, Alexander basically let it be known that he had subsequent plans to conquer Arabia and North Africa. He seems to have taken an interest in the North African city-state of Carthage. But those plans are extinguished by his premature death from fever and heavy drinking, somewhat time in June of 323. He had already been suffering some depression, significant depression, for months, because his best friend, Hephaestion, had died of, again, an epic drinking bout. And Alexander and this guy, Hephaestion, they were close since they were little kids, and there is a likelihood that they were probably lovers, because when Hephaestion died, Alexander went wild with grief, and he planned to build an elaborate temple to honor Hephaestion as a god. I mean, there were many, many rituals and ceremonies devoted to Hephaestion. And, of course, as a way of distracting himself, Alexander threw himself into preparing for his Arabian campaign by doing a kind of a first-hand reconnaissance of the marshy lowland area of southern Mesopotamia. And it is believed that it was on one of these field excursions that he contracted a malaria-like fever, and that, exacerbated by a 2-day drinking binge, that was enough to kill him. And unfortunately for his successors, Alexander made no plans about what should happen if he should die unexpectedly. I mean, here's a guy who probably thought he would live forever. His wife, Roxanne, you may remember that Bactrian princess he married. Roxanne was going to give birth to their first child a couple of months after Alexander's death. So there was no heir at that point when he had died. And there is one of those stories about Alexander that comes down to us that when he was on his deathbed, his commanders all gathered round him and asked him, Alexander, who will you have succeed you? Which one of us? And Alexander is believed to have said, to the strongest. And of course, after Alexander's death, these generals who all think, well, he said to the strongest, that's got to be me, right? And the other generals, of course, all believe it's them. So for the next 30 years, these generals, these successors, they're known as the Diadochi, they will carve up the empire and fight amongst one another for chunks of each other's territory. And ultimately, three great kingdoms are going to emerge. Antigonid Macedonia, Ptolemaic Egypt, and Seleucid Syria. And there will be a host of smaller kingdoms that are going to emerge, including the Greek kingdoms of Pergamum and Bactria and others. But it is a real nightmare for the next couple of decades after Alexander's death. And as a means of ending this story with some continuity, it's all this chaos in the East that will allow Rome in the West to develop to its full potential. And ultimately, some of you may know, it will be the Romans who will conquer what is left of much of Alexander's kingdom.